All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan. Steve and Terry Zinn, with gratitude to Hashem as they welcome their fifth grandchild, Gabriel Amichai Zinn, and in loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zinn Devara Bas Rabbi Yisrael Yoel, Zichron Livracha. Shandi and Avram Kelman, inauguration of the yahrzeit of Avram's father, Rafael Yechiel Ben Avram, Zichron Livracha, and our week of learning sponsors, Beryl and Rachel Golkin, in the schusser of Fushlim of their nephew, Chaim Meir Ben Cyril Bluma. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of those who need a refuah shav and together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, all of the neshama shav and aliyah, the families ein nechama, our hostages should be returned, and our soldiers should be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yadehem. But so with that, let us begin. We have an incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Yod Zayin 117, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis 116b. Last line. Boy Rabbi Amma Bar Mamo. Rabbi Amma Bar Mamo asked the following kasha. I suppose, remember again, yesterday we ended off with the Mishnah that spoke about the idea of where Ruvain owns a two-story home and Shimon is living in the upper story. The floor of the upper story, which is the ceiling of the lower story, opens up. And again, Ruvain is unwilling to fix it. So then the Mishnah points out that Shimon has the ability to move into the lower story. So, of course, the Gemara was getting into, we had a whole machlokes about how much does it have to open up. In other words, how much damage has to be done to the floor in order to make the domicile unusable, and therefore trigger Shimon's ability to go ahead and move downstairs. So that was our machlokes, Rav and Shmuel. Another Gemara asks a follow-up question. By Rabbi Amma Bar Mamo. So Rabbi Mamo asks the following question. Top of Kuf Yod Zayin. This is very interesting. Kishudar levado, hudar kimeikara, odilma shnehen darin. So both say, listen to this. I should say it differently. Kishudar levado, hudar kimeikara, odilma shnehen darin. So also here's the interesting shayla. So remember again, it's the same exact case. Reuven owns the two-story home, right? Shimon lives in the upper story. So now the floor goes ahead and opens up in the upper story. And now, let's assuming it opens up enough so that Shimon is allowed to move downstairs. See, here's the shayla. When Shimon moves downstairs, does Ruvain, let's assume in this case, Ruvain is living on the lower story. Does Ruvain have to vacate the lower story? Or is Ruvain allowed to live in the lower story? Now, we'll say, so essentially that would mean is, although Shimon is permitted to relocate to the lower story, Shimon's got a new roommate by the name of Ruvain. Or do we say, no, Shimon's right to relocate to the lower floor means that Ruvain has to vacate that lower floor. That's the lashon of the Gemara. Shudar, when Shimon goes down to live on the lower floor, levada hudar kidimei kara, does he have the right to live alone like he did in his upper story rental? O Dilma, Shnei Darin, or maybe again, as much as Shimon has the right to relocate, Shimon has to live with Reuven. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Levada Hudar, Ubalabayis Yotzi Mibeso Bal Karcho. So it says, you hear the Shaila? When we say that Shimon has a right to go to the lower floor, does that require, if Reuven is living on the lower floor, does that require Reuven to relocate to a different premises or not? Okay, so the Gemara says, Da'amarlei, adaita la'afkinon lo agri lecha. Because we'll say at the end of the day, so Reuven could always counter to Shimon, I rented you the upper story. I gave you the right to go ahead and technically live in the lower story should the upper story not become usable. But Lamaisa, I never guaranteed you any kind of right that I would vacate the place where I was living. So that's question one. Question one. Im tim salomar shnehem darinbo. So we'll say now, if you want to say, so let's assume right now. Let's go with the assumption, which is going to be the halacha l'maisa. Let's go with the assumption that when Shimon has given the right to relocate to the lower story, Reuven does not have to vacate the premises. If we assume that, means shnehem darinbo. So therefore, both Reuven and Shimon will both be living in the lower story. Kishu mishtamesh derech psachim mishtamesh. O derech gagim mishtamish. So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. So now that Shimon is given the right to live on the lower story, how does Shimon access the lower, we'll call it the first ground apartment? Does he have a right to use the front door? Or do we say no? He could access the front. He could access the first level apartment but he's got to do so through the second story. In other words, we'll say, so just to understand this, when Shimon was renting that aliyah, that upper story from Ruvain, so the way these homes were constructed, I will say, was there was an external staircase. That's what would happen. So now we'll say, so now here's the shaila. So now Shimon has the right to go ahead and live downstairs on the first story because his upper story has become unusable. So how does he access the lower story? Does he have the right to just walk in the front door like Ruvain does? Or do we say, no, you want to access the first story, that's fine. You have to go up into your apartment, into the aliyah, take the staircase up, and then you could lower yourself down through the hole in the floor, right? You could go ahead and come down like that, but you don't have the right to the front door. So we'll say, just understand, what the Gemara is trying to figure out over here is, the Mishnah has established that when Ruvain rents Shimon an upper story, and that upper story becomes unusable, so Shimon has the right to use the lower story now, until the upper story becomes reusable. We're trying to figure out now the parameters of that usage. So question number one was, does Shimon have exclusive use of the first story? The answer to that seems to be no, right? Then second question is, how does he access first floor? Could he just use the front door? Or maybe no, maybe in terms of access, he still has to go through his upper story and then come down to the first. So the Gemara says, Mi Amar Kidmei Kara. So we'll say, on one hand we could say, right, maybe Ruvain could say, maybe Shimon could say like this, Ma Mei Kara Derech Gagin, Hashnam Derech Gagin. On one hand we could say to Shimon, look, up until now, your access to to your domicile has been through a staircase. Derech Gagin literally means through the roof, right? But it means you would go ahead and get to your apartment through an external staircase. And if somehow you wanted to come downstairs, you'd have to come downstairs through the ceiling, through the roof. So hashtanami derech gagin. O dilma matzi amrlei aliyah kabili aloi, aliyah v'yarida lo kabili aloi. Or maybe Shimon could say to Ruvain like this, I was makabel upon myself that in order to use my apartment, I'd have to go up a staircase. In other words, I accepted the fact that l'maisa, using an aliyah, by definition requires a staircase. I never accepted upon myself that in order to use my domicile, I'd have to go up and go back down. That I was never makabel, and therefore now that as a result of our agreement, I have the right to use the lower story, I have the right to use the lower story using the front door, not going up and down. Okay? Imtim salomar matzah amarle aliyah v'yarida lo kabili aloi. So we'll say, so if we accept the premise, that let's say again, when Shimon, we're going to say, so now Shimon rented the upper story, right? So now halacha l'maaseh again, the upper story becomes unusable because there's a break in the floor. Now he's allowed to use the first floor. So we've already established that, number one. So Ruvain, if Ruvain is living on the first floor, Ruvain doesn't have to vacate the premises. And let's assume for a moment that when Shimon is now using the first floor, he could use the front door. Right? Because we say he never accepted upon himself to have to go up and come back down. So therefore he has the right to use the front door. So watch this. So Imdim Salomar, Matzi Amrle, Aliyah V'yarida Lo Kabili Aloi, Shtei Aliyos Zu Al Gav Zu Mahu. So we'll say it's very interesting. Let's say Ruvain is the proud owner of what we'll call like garden apartments. He has a three-story building. Okay, so now normally again, let's call it Ruvain is living on the first floor. Ruvain the owner is living on the first floor. Shimon was living on the second floor. Okay, now watch this. So Shtei Aliyos Zu Al Gav Zu, Ifchis Al Yona, Nochis V'dar B'Tachtona. Ifchis Tachtona, Mahu L'Mesik L'Gamre. So we'll say, now listen to this. What about the following situation? Take a look at Rashi. Ifchis aliyah al yona, Rashi says, Vusachar al yona, partially the dar b'tachtona. So we'll say, so of course, if Shimon, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. If Shimon is living in the upper story, third floor, so obviously, if the third floor apartment, if the floor opens up, where does he go? He goes down. So the Gemara says again, somehow, ifchis al yona, nachav v'dar b'tachtona. Obviously, if he's living on the third floor and something happens to the apartment, he goes down to the second floor. Ifchis tachtona, mahu lemislak. So mahu lemislak legamri bel yona. So we'll say, what happens if something happens in the second floor apartment, right? Can Ruvain, the owner of the building, tell Shimon, no problem, I'll relocate you. I'm relocating you to floor number 3. Right? So you're not moving down, you're moving up. You're moving up. So mahu lemislak legamre bel yona. Take a look at Rashi. No, sorry, not yet. So Gemara says, so that's about to say here the shaila. Up until now, we've always been focusing that when something happens in the upper story, you're moving down. So obviously, if he's in the third floor, something happens, move down to the second floor. If he's in the second floor and something happens, does Ruvain, the owner of the building, have the right to move him up to floor number 3? So mi arminan, da amarle shem aliyah kabila salai. So on one hand, Ruvain could say to Shimon, listen, you already agreed to live and not on ground level. Once you agreed to not live on ground level, so what's the big deal? Now I'm just going to move you to floor 3. Instead you were living on floor 2. Well, just accept that. Oh, Dilma, chad aliyah kabil alei, shtei aliyos lo kabil alei. I will say, or no, maybe we could say like this. Maybe Shimon could counter. Look, I accepted upon myself second floor. I never accepted upon myself third floor. I will say, now what's the logic in that? The logic in that is, remember that there is a certain level of tircha, right? There is a certain inconvenience that happens by living on an upper floor, right? You come back from your grocery shopping, and there is a big distinction between having to carry up that stuff 1 flight of stairs versus 2 flight of stairs. So maybe Shimon could say, listen, I accepted upon myself a second floor apartment, never accepted upon myself a third floor apartment, to which the Gemara says, Teiku. So we'll say, so here's what's interesting is, the Teiku really sounds, so remember the Gemara asks 3 questions, right? Question number 1 is when Shimon's living in the upper story and has to relocate to the bottom floor, does Reuven have to vacate the premises? Question number 2, when Shimon is relocated to the ground level, can he use the front door, or does he still have to go up the stairs and come back down through his apartment? And question number 3 is, if Shimon is living in a second floor apartment and the floor opens up, can Reuven relocate him to a third floor apartment, or does Shimon have the right to claim a first floor apartment? So I'll say, so technically speaking, the Teiku really goes on all 3. It's interesting that the halacha brings down the halacha l'maisa on the first 2. So that's, as I was mentioning it before, that halacha l'maisa, case number 1, Reuven, right, does not have to vacate the premises. That as much as Shimon is given the right to relocate to a ground floor apartment, but Reuven is permitted to remain there. Halacha number 2 is that Shimon, when he comes down to the ground floor apartment, is permitted to use the front door. The Teiku case is on the last one. The Teiku, the one that seems to still be a machlokes, or seems to be unresolved, is in this case of the 3-story building, and Shimon's living on floor number 2. Can Reuven force him to relocate to floor number 3, or does he have a right to come down to floor number 1? That seems to be the Teiku case. Okay, incredible. Let's go back there. We'll say, by the way, I'll also mention. Okay, fine. You know, the Rambam has a lot of these cases, but okay, we'll come back. Let's get to the end of the sugya first. Says the Rabbi, let's go back there. Rabbi Yossi Omar Takto no sines atikra. So we'll say, so remember again, then in the Mishnah, so the Mishnah said, Rabbi Yossi said that the guy living on the bottom floor, he provides the plaster. He provides the plaster for the ceiling, right? See, but Pashtos, a ceiling was made of 2 parts. There was wood, and then there was a coating of plaster on the wood. So Rabbi Yossi says the person living in the bottom apartment, the lower floor, provides the plaster for the ceiling. So I will say, so the fact that Rabbi Yossi comments on this seems to indicate that the Tanna Kama holds that the guy living on the upper story provides the plaster. So what's the machlokes over here? Says the Gemara, my tikra, by the way, what is this tikra? Well, what would they customarily make the ceiling out of? Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina Amar Kinim Visanon. So we'll say literally it means reeds and thorns. So apparently they would make some type of ceiling cohesive material out of reeds and thorns. They just pack it together. That would form the ceiling, and then you would cover it with plaster. So the Gemara says, Ustini Amar Reb Shimon Lakish. So this is interesting. Ustini is a person. Rashi says over here. Rashi says, Ustini Amar Reish Lakish Shem Chacham Talmido Shal Reish Lakish. That was his name. So Ustini, who was a Talmud of Reish Lakish, he said the following. Amar Shimon Lakish. So he says, Levachim. He says, what is the ceiling made out of? Rashi says, Min Sarim Shal Erez, boards of cedar wood. So again, one opinion says that the ceiling was some type of like compacted reeds and thorns. Other one said it was cedar wood. But that's not a machlokes. Mark Yasrei. Again, I will say, you know what? They built out of different materials in different places. Okay? Hano Beitrei Davudairi Chad Eloi v'Chad Tasai. So we'll say, interesting case over here. There were these two guys, right? Reuven and Shimon. Reuven and Shimon were living in a two-story building together. Chad Eloi, Reuven was living on top, and Shimon was living on the bottom. Ifchis Ma'aziva. So we'll say, so what ended up happening? The floor of the upper story, which was the ceiling of the lower story, opened up. Kimashi Maya is interesting. Kimashi Maya Eloi Azal Umaski Litasoi. So what happened? When Reuven in the upper story would wash his hands, the water would trickle down into the lower story and ultimately again and cause damage. So the Gemara says, "Mimaskin." So who is obligated to fix this? Supposed to say, you see here this? So there's a leak. There's a leak from the upper story into the lower story. So who has to fix this? Rav Chiya bar Abba Amar Ha'el Yor Matakin. Rav Chiya bar Abba says the upper story is obligated to fix this. Rabbi Eloi Mishra Rabbi Chiya bar Yossi Amar Hatachto Matakin. Rabbi Eloi says no. The bottom story, right? The guy in the bottom, in this case it's Shimon, is obligated to fix it. So we'll say V'Simin. If you want to remember who says what, the Yosef Hurad Mitzrayma. So we'll say, so again, because it's Rabbi Eloi saying in the name of Rabbi Chiya bar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, Yosef Hurad, the time Yosef was taken down to Egypt, Rabbi Yossi holds that it's the lower apartment's obligation to fix the ceiling. Okay, first wide line of Osai, 117a, Kof Yezhan Amud Aleph. Leima, Rabbi Chiya, Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Eloi, Beplukted, Rabbi Yosef, Rabban Kamiflagi. So let's say, by the way, I should tell you, what's incredible about these Gemaras is these are like tenant related, right? These are landlord-tenant relationships, or sometimes it's not even landlord. I literally, it's so interesting. Somebody just called me with a case like this last week about they're actually remodeling an apartment, and something happened with the air conditioning unit that they are remodeling. They're putting, I don't remember the details of it exactly, but they're putting in some type of unit. Something went wrong in the unit, and water started leaking into the apartment below. So there, again, it was a lot more pashut because it was actually the contractor who was installing the unit made a mistake in the way he was installing it. So there was like an element of probably also closer to Pshia. But again, I will say it's fascinating, right? So now there's a leak from the upper apartment to the lower apartment. Now in this case, it's not really a leak. In this case, what do you have over here? What's really happening over here? You have a faulty floor/ceiling. That's what's happening over here. So the water that's being used in upper story is flowing down and causing damage into lower story. Who is obligated to repair that floor ceiling? So again, Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, upper story. Rabbi Eloi and Rabbi Yossi, lower story. So it says the Gemara, Lema Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Rabbi Yossi, Lema Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Rabbi Eloi, beplukted Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanan kamiflagi. Let's align this machlokes with another machlokes, Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan. What's that machlokes? Here we go. Leman damar el yor metaken. We'll say the one who says ultimately again that the upper story is obligated to repair the floor ceiling. Kasara ala mazik laharchik es asmo min hanizak. So we'll say this opinion holds that it is the responsibility of the damager, the one who is damaging. It is his responsibility to prevent the damage from occurring. The mazik. Uman damer tachton metakin, the one who says that the lower story has to fix the floor ceiling. So kasavar al hanizak laharchik es atzmo min hamazik. He holds that it is the responsibility of the damaged party to distance himself from the damaging force. So we'll say, so you hear the shaila, you hear the machlokes. So who has the responsibility in a case of damage? So first opinion says, the one who is doing the damage. Now we're going to qualify this in just a little bit. The one who's doing the damage, he is the one who is obligated to ensure that no damage comes to anyone else. And therefore, I'm going to say, kind of extending this, we would assume who's the damager in this case? The upper story apartment. So therefore, it is his responsibility to go ahead and fix the floor ceiling. Second opinion says no. We'll say when you are being damaged, it is your obligation to distance yourself from the damaging force to prevent yourself from being damaged. Therefore, according to this approach, who would be obligated to fix the floor ceiling? The lower story, because he is the one being damaged. Okay, fascinating. Gemara says, 1 second. V'tizbara, Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanan le'inyan nezikim pligi. Are Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan arguing regarding damages? Is that what they're arguing about? V'ha ipcha sham'ina lehu. But yet, Rabbi Yossi, we have heard ultimately again the opposite approaches ascribed to them. This interesting case here. Marchikin esa'ila min abar esrim v'chamish amma. So we'll say the halacha is like this. In general, you have to distance. Excuse me. You have to distance a tree from a bar. We'll say, so again, let's say, what's the issue over here? The issue over here is roots. Right, trees have roots that extend far beyond them, and if you have a tree in too close of a proximity to a bar, to a water cistern, or to any pit, what could possibly happen? The roots could come through the walls of the bar. So therefore, the general halacha is you have to distance a tree from a bar 25 amas. But if you have a carob or a sycamore tree, 50 amas. So apparently they have longer root systems, and therefore you have to go ahead and distance them even more, 50 amas. 50 amas, bein milamala, bein min atzah. So we'll say that's true again, whether even if they are at different soil levels or they're side by side. Either way, you have to distance it. Now, Imabar kodem. So we'll say, what happens if the pit was there first? If the pit was there first, and someone went ahead and planted a tree within, let's say, 25 amas after the pit was already there, then what's the halacha? Kod seitz v'nosein damim. Ultimately, again, one goes ahead and cuts down the tree, but the owner of the pit has to pay the owner of the tree for lost value. Okay, b'ma'ilan kodem. But if the tree was there first, and then let's say again, then the other guy dug the pit afterwards, then lo yikots. Then of course we'll say then that responsibility is on the pit digger, right? Because l'maaseh again he decided to dig his pit after the tree was already there. Safek zek hadam v'safek zek hadam. What happens if you're not sure which one came first, right? Which one came first, the pit or the tree? Lo yikots. Ultimately, you don't have to cut down anything. Rabbi Yossi says, Afal pi will say, watch this. Afapi shabar kodemes le'ilan lo yikots. Rabbi Yossi says the truth is, even though the pit was there first, so when the tree owner plants his tree, he doesn't have to cut down the tree. But aren't we concerned with the roots of the tree growing into the pit? Rabbi Yossi, this is incredible. Shezeh chofer besoch shalo, v'zeh noteh besoch shalo. Rabbi Yossi, this is absolutely riveting. Rabbi Yossi says like this: the halacha says, you can do whatever you want in your own property. As long as you are acting legally in your property, you can't curtail somebody from doing something in their property that may or may not adversely impact someone else in their property. So if Reuven is planting a tree in his property, and Shimon is digging a pit in his property, but Reuven's tree is within 25 amas of Shimon's pit, okay. That's the price of having neighbors, right? If you don't want any problems with your pits, then go live in the middle of nowhere. Otherwise, recognize that your neighbors are going to be doing stuff on their property, and as long as, again, they're acting within the confines of their property, so then halacha l'maaseh, again, no one has any right to stop them. A really fascinating approach. Alma, what do you see from here? Alma, Rabbi Yossi Savar, Ala Nizak Laharchek Es Atzmo. So you see from here is Rabbi Yossi holds. I will say, now this is another way of saying that essentially, if you don't want to be damaged, then what? That responsibility is on you. In other words, so let's play this out. I want to plant a pit. I want to dig a pit. Right? I want to dig a bar in my backyard. So now, again, I have to be mindful of the fact that my neighbor Reuven has a right to do whatever he wants in his yard, including what? Plant trees all along the border of the yard. I have no right to say to Reuven, hey Reuven, I also have the right to use the border of my yard. So I want to put my pit on the border of my yard. You move your trees. Rabbi Yossi says you don't have a right to do that. In other words, so recognizing that your neighbor has the right to use his border of his field and he could put trees there. If you don't want roots growing into your pit, then what? Distance yourself. So Rabbi Yossi holds, I will say, it is the obligation of the individual to shield himself from damage. To shield himself from damage. It is not the obligation of the, now again, but I'll say, obviously, this is presupposing that's what? Everyone is using their property responsibly and legally. Right, that's what this presupposes. But what it says is, I'm allowed unfettered use of my property. That's what it means to own property. And therefore, again, the obligation is upon Ruvain to go ahead and shield himself from being damaged. A really incredible halacha. And therefore, V'Rabbanan Savri, the Rabbanan hold, ala mazik laharchich es atzmo. The Rabbanan hold that it's the obligation of the mazik to go ahead and shield himself from being damaged, from damaging. Ella, Ella pligi. Rather, we'll say if you want to frame what the machlokes is, it must be right. The Ella pligi. But Rabbi Yosef Rabbanan dahasam kamiflagi. Rabbi Yosef Rabbanan dahacha b'may pligi. What are you saying the Rabbanan over here arguing about? Bechozek tikra kamiflagi. So we'll say this is interesting. What they're arguing about is the necessary strength of a ceiling. So we'll say so now they're arguing about the fundamental nature of the obligation to strengthen the ceiling slash floor. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Rabbanan Sabri ma'aziva achzuke tikro v'achzuke tikra ala tachton by lachzuke. So we'll say what they're arguing about is the role of plaster, right? So here's what. See, apparently, everyone's agreeing on how the typical floor ceiling was constructed. It was wood, or reeds and thorns. But let's go with just wood, planks of cedar wood, with plaster on it. So the shaila is, what was the role of the plaster in that ceiling? So watch this. The Rabbanan hold, ma'aziva achzuke tikrahu. The point of the plaster was to go ahead and strengthen the ceiling. Therefore, v'achzuke tikra ala tachton, by lachzuke. The real role, essentially, let's say it a little bit differently. The real role of the plaster was to prevent leakage from upper stories to lower stories. That was the role. Therefore, again, who does the plaster really serve? Who does it serve? The lower story. So because it serves the lower story, therefore, again, the plaster obligation is on the lower story. So Rabbi Yossi Savra ma'aziva ashvuye gumosu v'ashvuye gumos ala elyon la'ashvuye. Rabbi Yossi says no. The role of the plaster actually was to create an even walking area. Otherwise, I will say, here's the problem. If you have a floor that is unplastered, it's going to be boards. Boards are often uneven, right? So walking on that is going to be very uncomfortable or even potentially dangerous. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, really what the plaster does is it evens out the walking area. If that's the case, whose purposes does the plaster really serve? The upper story, and therefore it is the upper story's responsibility to plaster the floor slash ceiling. It's really incredible. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi Savra ma'aziva ashvuye gumosu. It's a little to straighten out depressions or holes. V'ashvuye gumos ala elyon la'ashvuye. And ultimately, again, straightening out or smoothing out the holes is on the upper story to do so. So the Gemara says, Ini, is that so? Is that so? V'ha'amar of Ashi, ki avina be'rav kahana, hava amrinan, mo de Rabbi Yossi begirei delay, so the Gemara says, mo de Rabbi Yossi begirei delay. So we'll say, so now, okay, so let's go. There's a lot of stuff kind of happening over here. So really, it turns out that the machlokes as to who is obligated to plaster really just is a fundamental machlokes in terms of what is the role of plaster on a floor ceiling, right? Floor ceiling between first and second levels. So is the role of the plaster ultimately to prevent leakage? And if that's the case, really it's the responsibility of the lower story? Or no, the role of the plaster is to create an even walking area, in which case it is the role of the upper story. That's the fundamental machlokes. There's another machlokes, we'll say, that has now come about as well, which is, in general, when it comes to damages, who has the obligation in terms of preventing damage? Is it the mazik, the damager, who has the obligation to prevent damage, or the damaged party who has the obligation to distance himself from damage? So the Gemara says over here as follows. So v'amar Ravashi ki avina be'Rav Kana hava amri bod Rabbi Yossi begiri delay. But Rabbi Yossi, so now here's what's interesting, right? So Rabbi Yossi, just to tie this all together, Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah was the one who said that the lower guy has the obligation to go ahead and plaster the ceiling. Right? That's the obligation, which indicates to us what? Which indicates to us that halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yossi holds that the role of the plaster is to prevent leakage, and Rabbi Yossi also holds that al hanizak laharchik es atzmo. It is incumbent upon the damaged party to distance himself from being damaged. Now, as Rabbi say, it's such an interesting idea. Even though, again, there's a damager, it is the responsibility of the damaged party to do whatever is within his power to prevent himself from being damaged. But Rabbi Yossi holds begirei delay. Rabbi Yossi also holds that halacha. Now, girei delay means literally again the arrows. That when a damager directly damages a damaged party, that the damager is responsible. So Rabbi Yossi holds that Shechaifa damages. If that's the case again, then Rabbi Yossi, we're talking about leakage over here, right? Remember, how did all of this start? This all started with there's water leaking from the upper story to the lower story. Who's chayiv? Who's chayiv? Doesn't Rabbi Yossi, so wouldn't Rabbi Yossi hold that in a case like this, the upper story would be chayiv, to which the Gemara says, listen to this, Rabbi Yossi, de paski mayiv ahadr nafli. Rabbi Yossi would go like this. If you could imagine, if Ruvain is literally Ruvain's upper story, Shimon's lower story. If Ruvain's pouring water, right? And literally again, he's pouring water, and water is going directly into Shimon's lower apartment. Everyone agrees that Ruvain is chayiv. Now they will say, what's the case over here? The case over here is that Ruvain is brushing his teeth, right? He's washing negel vaser, and what happens? And water is going into the sink. And from the sink, because the ceiling is not properly plastered, over time it's leaking down. It's an indirect damage. So let me tie this, and that's the case where Rabbi Yossi will say that the damager is not chayiv. Why? Because it is incumbent upon the damaged party to distance himself from damages. In this case, how would the damaged party have distanced himself from damages? How would he do that? By reinforcing the plaster, or putting the plaster on the floor ceiling. So Rabbi will say, so now, so first off, if we tie this all together, so first of all, again, we have our machlokes as to who is responsible for going ahead and putting the plaster on. Okay, so we'll see in just a moment. But really, the more overarching machlokes is when there is a damaging force, who is obligated to take care of that damaging force? Is it the damager who is obligated to stop it, or the damaged party who we say distance yourself, right? Prevent damage from happening to you. So I will say, so listen to this. So the Rambam Paskins, this actually appears really in two different cases. Let me quote to you both just very quickly. So the halacha is like this. So the Rambam quotes, this is both in Hilchos Shchenim, Perek Yud, first in Halacha Hey, and then in Halacha Zayin. So first I want to quote to you let me actually quote to you Zayin. So the Rambam here quotes this case of the pit and the tree. Misha lo ilan besoch sadeo karav labar. So imagine for a moment there's Reuven and Shimon, they're neighbors, right? Reuven has a tree in his field that's very close to Shimon's pit, but they're both working in their own properties. Ein balabar yachal la'akev alav v'lomar hari sharshe ha'ila nichnas lebar shali u'mafsidin also sheze nezak haba me'ela v'hu la'achar zmanu be'eshonata ina maziko. All right, so let's actually, pause there for just a second. Let me read to you the principle first. Ein sarich laharchik b'ktei shelo yazik v'ala nizak laharchik es atzmo im yira shelo yagia lo hanezak. So we'll say the halacha is, the way the Rambam Paskins, is we hold al hanizak laharchik. The responsibility to stave off damage is upon the damaged party, right? So in other words, halacha l'maisa. So just to play this out, Let's go with the pit and the tree case, right? I'm neighbors with Ruvain. I have a pit. Ruvain's planting a tree, right? Or I'm going to plant. Ruvain has every single right to go ahead and plant a tree on his border, and I can't stop him. His roots are going to grow into my pit. He has the right to do that, and if I want to stave off damage, I have to go ahead and do whatever I can. Now, there's a very important qualification to this. What's the important qualification? The damage is not direct, and the damage is not immediate. So that's why the tree and the pit case is a good case, right? It's a nice Sunday afternoon. I see Ruvain planting trees along our property line, and I'm ready to say, stop, you can't do that, because over time what's going to happen? Those trees are going to establish root systems. That root system is going to come into my property. Because there are no root systems now, because there's no damage now, it's just foreseeable future damage and realistic damage that could happen. I don't have any right to stop Ruvain. It is incumbent upon me to distance myself. Obviously, I will say, direct direct, immediate damage, that's the responsibility of the mazik. So let's go back now to our apartment case. So therefore, in this case, where Ruvain, upper story, is using his apartment in a normal way, but just over time, there's some type of leakage that is occurring as a result of a lack of plaster. So that's a case of indirect, non-immediate damage. In that case, the halacha is al hanizak laharchik es atzmo. It is incumbent upon the damaged party to distance himself from being damaged. In other words, take care of yourself. Prevent yourself from being damaged. But that's only when it's delayed, well, not non-immediate, indirect damage. For immediate, direct damage, then of course the responsibility is going to be on the mazik. I will say, there's also a tremendous musar haskell in this, which is that in Yiddishkeit, in halacha, we do not believe in a victim mentality. Take care of yourself. But it's not right. This person's doing this person's doing this is it. You're right. You're right. Sometimes life is very unfair, and sometimes people act in irresponsible ways, and sometimes things that people do has an adverse impact on me. Got it. You can't control what other people do, but you absolutely respond. You can actually absolutely have control over how you respond and what proactive or preventative measures you are able to take in life to prevent yourself from falling into the clutches of harm. We can't play the role of the victim. I will say, you look around what's happening in the world today, it's such an incredible thing. The difference between Am Yisrael and the rest of the world, right, is that the world, obviously I'm making a sweeping generalization, right, but Lamaisa, people love to play the victim card, and they play the victim card all of the time. There are no greater victims in the history of mankind than the Jewish people. We have been subjected to anything and everything, yet you'll never hear us saying that we're entitled to anything. You'll never hear us saying that the world owes us anything. Never once. Why? Because the greatness of Klal Yisrael is that at the end of the day, we're not the victim. Well, even though we've been the victim, al hanizak laharchik es atzmo. We recognize and we will never forget what humanity has visited upon us throughout the ages, but we also recognize that our destiny remains in our hands. Of course, with incredible siyata d'shmaya. And as such, we choose to make of ourselves what we choose to make of ourselves. Don't play the victim card. Don't play it nationally. They'll say, at the end of the day, the buck of your life stops with you. Whatever you do or you don't accomplish is your responsibility and your responsibility alone. There are negative forces or negative influences in your life. Chances are you're not going to change them. But what you can do is distance yourself from them. Al hanizak laharchik es atzmo. There's something that's misfiring in your life, something that's negative in your life, assuming that you can't fix it, distance yourself from it, and go on to become the best version of yourself. I will say, let's go weiter. Mishnah. A lot more to say in the halacha. It's actually some really great halacha cases, but we'll leave it for a different time. Habayis v'halia shel shnayim shenaflu. We'll say, very interesting case here. In this case, this is jointly owned property, right? So Reuven and Shimon own a two-story home together, right? Reuven, let's just keep it easy, right? Reuven owns the lower story, Shimon owns the upper story. So what happens? Amar bala aliyah lebala bayis livnos. So Shimon says, okay, no, I want to rebuild my upper story, but obviously I can't rebuild my upper story if you don't rebuild your lower story. V'huein arotz livnos, and Reuven doesn't want to rebuild. Now, I'll say for whatever the reason, I don't know, he likes the insurance money, or just whatever, he's just not ready to rebuild. Hare bal ha'aliyah bona es habayis. We'll say, by the way, it's maisim b'chol yom, where things that we have built come tumbling down, and for whatever the reason, I just can't get my act together to rebuild. Even though, when I don't rebuild, it puts other people at a disadvantage. I will say, my lack of rebuilding impacts my family, impacts my friend, impacts my community, impacts Klal Yisrael. Such a tremendous thing. So in this case over here, right, Shimon lives in the upper story. He can only rebuild if Reuven does his part, but Reuven's not doing his part. So what's the halacha? Bona es habayis chedar b'socha ad shitin lo sitz Yosef. So it's actually interesting. So Shimon, if he wants, Shimon can rebuild the entire structure. Right? And he could occupy. I can't use that word. Right? He could go ahead. He could live in the lower structure, in the lower apartment, and only once Ruvain pays him back for the amount of money spent on rebuilding the lower apartment, then Shimon could give him access to it. Okay, interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Yehuda says no. If Shimon, if you're going to live in the lower story, which technically speaking belongs to Ruvain, you could do that, but you have to go ahead and pay him rent. Mr. Rabbi say this is an interesting case of zenene v'zelo chaser. We'll see this in the Gemara. But Allah again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you still have to pay him rent. Rashi says over here, Am Rabbi Yehuda af zeh dar b'sof shachaveiro im kain hu af bal ha'aliyah zeh kishu chozer ma'osav lazeh hu dar b'sof shalo v'inami zelo chaser dehalav hachi lo havi bani le ihu tzarch lahalos lo schar dezeh miyan nene. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, if you benefit from someone else's property, even if the other party doesn't suffer a loss as a result of it, you still have to go ahead and pay rent. So Rabbi Yehuda will say you have to pay rent. Okay, so the Gemara says, Ella bala bonas abayis vesaliyah makras halyona v'yoshi bebayis adshitin osis yosov. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda says like this. Now, so up until now we were focusing on the idea, according to the Tanakama, so what could happen over here is, right, so remember, Reuven doesn't want to rebuild his lower story. So what Shimon can do is Shimon can rebuild the lower story, right, go ahead and live in it, and say, I'm not vacating it until you pay me for it, and then once you pay me for it, he'll build his upper story. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can't do that, because then Shimon is benefiting from Reuven's property, and Shimon would have to pay Reuven rent. What Shimon can do is build the entire two-story structure, right, build the entire two-story structure, complete it, and then he could choose to live in the lower story. Why? Because in that case, he's not really getting hana. He's not really getting any benefit. Why isn't he getting benefit? Because halacha l'maisa, he could have just as easily lived in the upper structure, and therefore halacha l'maisa, he's not considered to be benefiting from Reuven's property, and therefore wouldn't have to pay him rent. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, Makras hayon v'yoshev achitin osis Yosef. Good. Amud beis. Amud Rabbi Yochanan. So I'll say very interesting halacha over here. So we'll say, so we're going to focus first on Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion like this. So Tanakama. So again, one more time. Reuven and Shimon both own a two-story structure together. Reuven lives on the lower story. Shimon lives on the upper story. The structure falls down. And I'll say, it's interesting now, part of the beauty of this parak is it's following a beautiful progression, right? We started out with, what do you do when the building falls down, right? How do you divvy up the materials? So we saw that. Now, I'll say, so now how to divvy it up. In this case over here, Reuven, the lower story, is refusing to rebuild his first floor. As a result, that precludes Shimon from building. So what are Shimon's options? So Tanakama said, again, Shimon could rebuild the first floor and essentially live in there until Reuven's willing to go ahead and buy him out. That's essentially what he could do. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can't do that, because then Shimon is benefiting from Reuven's property, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that when you benefit from someone's property, you must pay them for it, even in a case where the owner of the property is not losing anything. Now the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says, B'shlosha makamot shana lan Rabbi Yehuda, asr lo li adam shiena mimamon chavero. So I'll say there are three places where Rabbi Yehuda taught us that you are not allowed to benefit from your friend's property without payment. In other words, you can benefit, but you have to go ahead and pay for that benefit. You can't benefit for free. Where are the three situations? So the Gemara says, chada hadisnan. So first of all, one that we just spoke about, right? So Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, Shimon can't rebuild the lower story and live there for free. That's number one. Idach mahi. What's another example? Disnan. Let's say these are all cases we actually had before. It's very exciting. Idach hadisnan hanosin semer letzava letzvoa. I give wool to the dyer to dye, and I asked him letzvala adam. I asked him to go out and dye it red. Utzva'u shachar, and he dyed it black. Or shachar utzva adam, it doesn't really matter. The point over here is, I asked him for one color, he dyed it a different color. What's the halacha? Remer omer, no sin lo demeit samra. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, what the dyer made, obviously the dyer made a mistake. What's the halacha? The dyer has to give me back the value of the raw wool that I gave him, or the unprocessed or the undyed wool that I gave him. That's the halacha. He gives me back the value. Rabbi Yehuda omer, no. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Im hashevach yosar alotza, no sin lo seyitzia." So Rabbi Yehuda says like this: I get the wool back. I, the owner of the wool, get the wool back. and I have to pay for something, right? We look at the lower of two values. Either shevach is the appreciation, or Yetzia represents the Hotzah represents the expenses. So whatever is the lesser of the two amounts, either appreciation or expenses, right? That's what I pay. So if Hashevach Yosra al if ultimately the appreciation is more than the expenses, then no sin lo Yetzia, I give him the expenses. But if the expenses are more than the appreciation, no sin lo shevach, then I go ahead and I pay for the appreciation. So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. Remember we saw this before in Bava Kama. It's so interesting, right? Rabbi Meir makes so much sense, right? Rabbi Meir says, I gave Reuven wool to dye red. He dyed it black. So now, what's the halacha? Just give me back the value of what I gave you, and let's call it even, right? Rabbi Huda has this whole thing. I get back my wool, and what? And now again, we decide what's the lower of the two amounts, the expenses or the appreciation. Why? So Rashi understands over here, Rashi is explaining, or the Gemara is explaining, Rabbi Huda's whole chap is, it's not fair to allow the dyer to hold on to the wool, because that gives him benefit from my property. Why? Because we'll say now the dyer ends up with wool. He didn't have to go to the marketplace. He didn't have to procure it. He didn't have to shop around for it. So therefore, again, the dyer is effectively benefiting from my property without any kind of real compensation. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda holds the dyer has to give me back the wool. I have to recognize that the dyer did perform a service, but I only have to give him the lesser of the two amounts, either the expenses or the appreciation. So the Gemara is using this as an example. You see from here that Rabbi Yehuda does not allow you to benefit from someone's property without payment. What's the third case? V'idach maihi visnan. Misha, interesting case here. Misha para mixas chovo v'hishlish eshtaro. So say here's the case. I borrowed $10,000 from Ruvain. Okay, so now Abba says, so what did I do? I pay him back $5,000. Now there's a document here. There's a document. V'amrlo, and the hishlish eshtaro. So I say, and then we give the document to a third party, right? So I lent Ruvain. I lent Ruvain. I borrowed from Ruvain $10,000. I paid him back $5,000. We give the document to be held by a third party. Okay, so I still owe Reuven another $5,000. V'amrlo, im ein ani nosin lecha mikan va'adzman plan. I say, Reuven, if I don't pay you back the remaining $5,000 within a month, then ploni tein lo shtaro. I say to the third party, give Reuven back his shtar. Now both say, what does that shtar say? Right? That shtar says that Silber owns Ruvain $10,000. By giving Ruvain back that document, what does that effectively do? It entitles him to collect an additional $5,000. So what would be the status then of the first $5,000? It would be a matana. So I will say, essentially, in this case over here, I'm saying if I don't pay back the remainder in a month, I'm giving Ruvain the ability to recollect the entire debt, and therefore we'd have to classify the first $5,000 as a matana, otherwise it'd be ribis, right? We'd have to classify it ultimately again as a matana. So I'll say higiyazman velo nasan. So okay, so let's play this out. So let's say again a month goes by and I have not paid back the remaining $5,000. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yitain. So look, a deal is a deal, right? I made a condition. I said if I don't pay back within a month, give the document back to Ruvain. So a month goes by and I did not go ahead and pay it. So halacha l'maisa, I have to go ahead and pay it back. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yitain. Rabbi Huda says lo yitain. Rabbi Huda says ultimately again I don't give it back. Now we'll say, now here's what's interesting. What's Rabbi Huda's logic? Well, the Gemara is assuming what is Rabbi Huda's logic? Rabbi Huda's logic is like this. It wouldn't be fair to give it back to the lender. Why? Because then the lender is essentially benefiting from me without any, just benefiting, just free benefit. In other words, because think about this, if the third party gives the shtar back to Ruvain, then Ruvain gets a free $5,000. So he gets to recollect the debt in its entirety, and he gets an entire $5,000. The Gemara is using this as a proof that Rabbi Yehuda says, "Asra li adam she'enu mamun chavero." You can't just freely benefit from someone else's money. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that Allah Chalamais, in this case, we can't return the document to Reuven. So both say the Gemara therefore conclusively brought three cases where Rabbi Yehuda espouses the same principle. You can't benefit from someone's property freely. Now again, how did all of this start? This started in our Mishnah. Remember again, let's go back to our first case, right? Reuven and Shimon own a two-story house, right? Two-story building in partnership. Reuven lives on the lower floor, Shimon lives on the upper floor. The building falls down. Reuven doesn't want to rebuild. So Tanakama says, no problem, Shimon, you rebuild the lower story, and live in it until Reuven's willing to buy you out. So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can't do that, because if Reuven's going to live in it, then what does he have to do? He has to pay Shimon rent. So you see from here again that Rabbi Yehuda holds you can't benefit from someone else's property freely. The Gemara then quotes two other cases. We'll say, now the Gemara says, no. Amai. So first the Gemara says, I think you might be drawing wrong conclusions. Dilma ad kamo kam Rabbi Yehuda hacha elamishum diika shachrurisa. So we'll say, so first of all, the Gemara now is going to go through each of these cases and highlight the idea that maybe this is not about benefiting from people's property freely, right? This is not about asrli adam shem umamun chavero. Rather, again, there's a good reason why Rabbi Yehuda holds his particular sheet in each of these cases. In the case of the home, so I'll say again, if Shimon goes in and rebuilds the lower story and lives there, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to pay him rent. Why do you have to pay him rent? We'll say it's a very good reason. There's wear and tear. Shacharisa literally means the blackening of the walls, right? You're going to cook in there, you're going to do stuff in there. There's wear and tear. So it would be unfair, even though, again, Shimon is the one who's rebuilding it, it's unfair for Shimon to use without any kind of fee, because, again, there is wear and tear on the property. Okay. Inami, in the case of the wall, the wall case is also different. And we'll say, why is the wall case different? Because the dyer is deviating from the agreement. And what's the halacha? That time we learned, well, so whenever you have an agreement with someone and someone deviates in the agreement, the halacha is the deviator always has the lower hand. So in this case over here, this is not about being nana from Mamun Chavero. This is about changing the terms of the contract. So you change the terms of the contract, at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, there's repercussions for that. Umisha parameisa schovonami havi asmachta v'shamina leid Rabbi Yehuda de Amar lo kani. I will say furthermore again, the loan case, the reason Rabbi Yehuda says in the loan case, if I fail to pay after a month, don't give the money, don't give the shtar back to the lender. That's because this whole thing is an asmachta. This whole thing is hyperbolic. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that asmachta lo kanya, ultimately again, hyperbolic or hyperbole does not create binding legal realities. The Gemara is just pointing out over here, it could very well be that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of this principle of asali adam shenem imamun chavero, but rather, again, he has his particular position in these three cases for three very specific other reasons. Incredible. Amar Rav Acha bar Adam mishmei deula. Tachton haba l'shanos b'gvil shomla. So we'll say, now this is very interesting. Now in this case, let's actually just begin this today. But in this case now we'll say, same case. Reuven and Shimon, right, jointly owned a two-story building. Reuven lives on the bottom, Shimon lives on the top. The building falls down. Now they want to rebuild it. So up until now we've been focusing on a case where Reuven, the lower story, doesn't want to rebuild. Now we're talking about they want to rebuild, but what? They want to rebuild differently. So Reuven wants to rebuild differently. So for example, Amar Rav Acha mishmei deula tachton haba l'shanos. So let's say again, Reuven now wants to rebuild, but he wants to make changes. For example, bigvil shomelo, begazis in shomelo. So we'll say, so let's say again, the structure itself was originally made out of hewn stone, right? Like chisel type stone, hewn stone. Now what happens? Shimon wants to change it. Reuven wants to change it. Reuven wants to go ahead and make it out of unchiseled stone, non-hewn stone. The halacha is he can make that change. Now we'll say, what's the chap? So apparently, unhewn stone provides a wider wall than chiseled stone. The wider the wall, the more sound the structure is. So if Reuven wants to change from chiseled stone, from hewn stone to unhewn stone, he's allowed to do that. The reverse is not true. If he wants to change from unhewn stone to hewn stone, that he can't do. Bikfisin shomelo, bilevenim ain't shomelo. So Rashi points out over here, Bekfisin, Rashi says, is archei chatzi levenim, v'rachban tefach u'mechza, v'nosin ariach mikan v'ariach mikan. So I will say, so again, if he wants to go ahead and change from half bricks to full bricks, right? Bekfisin shomelo, so belevenim ain't shomelo. So apparently, again, when they used kfisin, right, which were these smaller bricks, half bricks, you ended up laying one half brick by the other, and because of the mortar in between, it's interesting, using two half bricks created a wider wall than using one regular brick. So again, we'll stop over, we'll pick up with this tomorrow, Miras Hashem. But essentially what we're going to see is the klal is a very simple one. What's the klal? Anything that makes the structure stronger, you're allowed to do. Anything that weakens the structure, you're not allowed to do. We're just going to go through these examples one by one. Tremendous, Rabosai. Shkoyach. What's a bear band?